Good afternoon. Good afternoon, and welcome to this session. Shaqi wonogel kinmatioshir chiwe shishpekuk ri winak chishpe ural ershokoger ri winak kichikitan inutzich pariq ashbaltzich nbeen abeshnin kohti enachchuila ural ruk cultural survival. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Abeshnim Kohti. Thank you so much for joining us in this session. My name is, I'm from the community of Chuila and also a member of Cultural Survival. The title of this session is Indigenous Women in Climate Change Solutions, a holistic and rights-based approach to forest and food and finance. Cultural Survival, which is the organizing, one of the organizations that put together this session, welcomes everybody. I would like also, before we start, I would like to thank GLF for helping us in putting together this session of these wonderful women that are going to speak today. As you know, climate change is affecting many vulnerable communities, and among those vulnerable communities are Indigenous peoples. We are at the brunt of the impact of climate change, especially because our communities are located in territories where the biodiversity is getting lost and where we feel the impact of forest fires and inundations as well. As Indigenous peoples, our identity is intrinsically connected to the land. Our cultures and languages directly reflect our connection with the territories we inhabit. As whole ecosystem collapse due to the climate change, our ways as well is being affected. There is a climate crisis worldwide, and Indigenous people bear this impact. Within the Indigenous communities, women are also feeling this impact. Indigenous women's voices and leadership must be part of the decision-making process in facing this climate crisis. Women, as knowledge keepers and caretakers, have a strong relationship with Mother Earth, the livestock, ceremonies, sacred places, traditional medicine, traditional knowledge. And with, on behalf of the families and the communities, we interrelate with forests and territories where we inhabit. Today, we would like to listen the voices of remarkable women that are accompanying us here from different regions, so that they can share with us the contributions that Indigenous communities, and more specifically, the contributions of Indigenous women to the climate change solutions. In first place, I would like to introduce Andrea Carmen from the Yaqui Nation. She has been the executive director of the International Indian Treaty Council since 1992. Andrea was IITC's team leader for work on the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, and in 1997 was one of two Indigenous representatives to formally address the UN General Assembly for the first time at the UN Earth Summit +5. In 2006, Andrea was selected as rapporteur for the UN Expert Seminar on Indigenous Peoples' Permanent Sovereignty over Natural Resources and their relationship to land, the first Indigenous woman to serve as rapporteur for the UN Expert Seminar. In 2019, she was selected to represent North American Indigenous peoples on the Facilitated Working Group of the United Nations Climate Change Forum for local communities and Indigenous peoples platform in its first 3 years of operation, and served as its second co-chair until May of 2021. So to start this session, I would like to welcome Andrea. Thank you so much, Andrea. And my first question to you is, what do you see as the contributions and the role of Indigenous women in climate change solutions as it relates to food sovereignty or food systems of Indigenous communities?
Respectful greetings to you, my family in the room, and those that are listening virtually. When we first organized an international forum for Indigenous peoples on food sovereignty. It was in 2002, Lake Atitlan in Guatemala, and there were Indigenous peoples from all over the world. We decided there, the same as we continued here into these discussions on climate change globally, that whatever the states do, whatever the UN bodies do, we needed to take the primary responsibility on the ground in our communities to restore our food sovereignty and to continue our ways of life and ways of knowing. And women have always been in the forefront. And now we're faced with a dual crisis that has severely impacted in many, many ways our food sovereignty as well as our health, which is, of course, climate change and COVID-19, which has doubled the impact in many of our communities, especially those in North America, which include many of our rural Indigenous reservations and Indigenous peoples' homelands. They're called food deserts. For example, the Tonotum, which is our neighbors in Arizona, have the second largest reservation in all of the United States after the Navajo Nation. It's the size of Connecticut, the state of Connecticut. They have one grocery store. And so it was a huge impact on Indigenous peoples and especially Indigenous women responsible for feeding their families when these dual crises began to happen. So I would like to bring voices of other Indigenous women into this discussion. And I have a short video with some clips from a representative from that same Tohono Nation I mentioned, as well as a Maori elder from Aotearoa, New Zealand, and Guatemala, Conevigua, Rosalina Tuyuk and her organization, just really quick to show what Indigenous women are doing to use their own knowledge of food, medicine, seeds, and how we're bringing those ways back into our communities to address and be resilient and adapt to climate change, as well as respond to the impacts of COVID-19. So I'd like to ask our technician friends to start the video, and I do appreciate your attention. Chokwiltasia. This has a song. We need the audio.
Shashawanye kawa hoka maho honye woshanye maha maha ona iruya. Seed sovereignty and the reclamation of our seeds, the repatriation and rematriation of our seeds back to our communities is so important, especially now in times of the pandemic, where we were able to see why it was so important for us to have our traditional foods and access to our traditional foods, not just to grow them and provide good food back to the community, but also to reclaim the health of our bodies in order to fight things like COVID-19. To experience the work of bringing seeds back to the people has been so healing and so powerful, and being able to see how we can also reclaim our ways of being self-sufficient and self-reliable on each other as a community has been really empowering to see through this work. And also with that, we stand firm in our belief in the United Nations Declaration for the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, Article 31, which states that Indigenous peoples have the right to maintain, control, protect, and develop their cultural heritage, traditional knowledge, and traditional cultural expressions, which do include our seeds and our foods.
Desde Conaviva nos hemos organizado para la sobrevivencia en la soberanía alimentaria, también para la búsqueda de justicia para las mujeres, al igual como la formación de la juventud. Es tan importante para Conaviva ver este trabajo, puesto que las mujeres han logrado sostener una agricultura respetuosa y en armonía con la madre tierra, el bosque y el agua.
Porque Terox y revueltas caen de brosa y de Pasang y Chaj, Chortjo, Chivacamin Jareni, Jun y Chaj, ni Tej, buen rojesu, chile, chulef, man abono taman química tastaspe, y Rox caen, soje, Hamontaña, soje, se cama 10 sacos de brosa, chipala que te la se cama. Macamica con cabros y cada caticón, jarir revuelta, caen chipalule, y jarir y con caticón está con abón.
Conaviva entonces ha decidido abrazar la soberanía alimentaria como una apuesta política para lograr también luchar contra las transnacionales, luchar contra los agrotóxicos y luchar también contra toda forma de exterminio sobre las semillas naturales.
La verdad, yo así no estoy usando abono químico, sino que es pura brosa, lo que también le da fuerza a las plantas que crezcan también, ¿verdad? Puro natural lo que yo estoy tratando. Pues ese es uno de mis objetivos de un principio, tener algo natural. Si voy ahorita al mercado, yo puedo conseguir remolacha, tal vez yo puedo comprar, pero no sé cuántos químicos ha traído eso, ¿verdad? Entonces es una pena y un riesgo para las.
The tui sings in my forest every day. In the winter times, he is there dominating a rongoa forest, a healing forest. The healing forest of Māori, that is so important for us just to learn to live with our forests, because our forests have been devastated in this country, and Pinus radiata replaces the beauty of a forest like this. This forest sits at the back of my home, where my mokopuna, Kane, and myself planted our forest so that we could live and learn the healing power of our trees, our beautiful trees. You have Cody in this forest. Here you have the Banksia. She is in her moon time and she's bleeding, and you can see her very clearly, having her ikura, as we say, but it's that time and that beauty of the winter where she is beginning to sleep. So I want to say that it's so important for Māori and for Indigenous peoples of the world to know the healing plants. As here in Aotearoa, we're just being finally in the Taitokira, in the Great North, they are finally acknowledging and putting a rongoa healing clinic within the hospitals there. So it is a lot of work being done by the people of the whenua. And I would like to sing to you a song, a karakia, that talks to the forest. Pakataka te hau ki te uru. Pakataka te hau ki te tonga. Kia makina kina ki uta. Kia matara tara ki tai. E ia ke ana te atakura. E tio he huka he hauhu.
Magdosha Carme, Andrea, Romasha Kutschke, Rupatan Shikri, Takiha, Shpaman Kakomon. Thank you so much, Andrea, for showing us this video. And when it comes to talking about Indigenous peoples and the relationship with the land, it's not just a theoretical or a cosmovision, but it's what we call, in Spanish, is called cosmovivencia. That's a way of living. And that means a very strong relationship, but in a day-to-day life. It's where people get the food, it's where people get our medicines, and where women have a strong traditional knowledge that comes from the land and is reproduced or shared with the family and the community. Next, I would like to introduce to Pasang Doma Sherpa. She is the Executive Director of the Center for Indigenous Peoples Research and Development, CIPRED. She has worked with Indigenous peoples, women, and local communities for the recognition of their traditional knowledge, cultural values, customary institutions that contribute to sustainable management of forests, ecosystems, biodiversity, and climate resilience for more than a decade. Ms. Sherpa has a PhD from Kathmandu University on climate change education and its interfaces with Indigenous knowledge. She has served as a co-chair of the International Indigenous Peoples Forum on Climate Change, and she's a board member of UN RED, participant committee of the Forest Carbon Partnership Facility, World Bank, and presently she's a member of the Facilitating Working Group of Local Communities and Indigenous Peoples Platform of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. She's also a chair of the Specialist Group on Indigenous Peoples' Customary and Environmental Laws and Human Rights at the Commission on Environmental, Economic, and Social Policy, and she's a visiting faculty at Kathmandu University. She's going to share with us what are the contributions for a tipping point when it comes to the relationship of Indigenous peoples and the management and relationship with forests. Ms. Shepard.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. My apology being a bit late, but I'm happy to be here, and thank you for this invitation, and especially bringing all Indigenous women around the world here to share our stories and also, reflect our experience on the ground, and how that experience is so important to be reflected in the discourse of climate change, in the discourse of natural resource governance, and discourse of the sustainability in the global forum. And I'm really thankful for Cultural Survival, for your efforts to bringing the voice from the ground and the struggle of the Indigenous women, Indigenous peoples at the national level, and to make sure that our voice to be heard at the global forum, so that our discourse here at the global forum will have a positive impacts for changing the present status and bringing the hope for Indigenous peoples and Indigenous women, particularly at the national and the ground level, for continuity of our customary governance system, continuation of our values and knowledge system that contributed for generation to sustain the ecosystem, biodiversity, and climate change resilience. How long do I have time?
7 minutes.
Okay, yeah, so I'll just share that the fact that you all are aware the outcome of the study of ICBES or IUCN, or even covered by the IPMG or World Bank, that how the contribution of around 5% of Indigenous people around the world contributed for more than safeguarding more than 80% of the biodiversity. That is a very important fact. But however, the sad part, despite the outcome of the study, even the IPCC talk about the crucial role of Indigenous knowledge system for the climate change resilience, the role and contribution of Indigenous peoples, especially in the local laws, hardly been heard. So these issues, challenges should be heard, need to be heard, have to be heard, must be heard, Otherwise, we'll not have a sustainable solution for if you really want to go move on, no? Because the present climate crisis already clearly shows that modern life is no way out. We do not have a sustainable solution. The basis of the sustainable solution is how we are sustaining with the nature. The other day in a meeting, one of our knowledge holders were mentioning that, if you really want to have a sustainable solution, live natural life. In the absence of the natural life, if you have a plastic life, no solution for future solution. So the natural life is the life of indigenous peoples, because we are living on nature, because we are living with a symbiotic relation with the natural resources. And natural resources is in the crisis now, because it's not the cause we are brought up, but the cause from our modern life, our the industrial life, our all these capitalistic worldviews, capitalistic belief system, and the trend, and the whole culture that brought it, which is also influencing our young generation. So this is what I really believe, that this need to be a change, and we need to bring the paradigm shift, and at least our children need to understand that the business as usual model will not work out. Like one of the crises, because I'm the students from the education. If you go to the university, this is the Glasgow University, and many of us, I'm sure, we have hardly heard about Indigenous knowledge system. Because why? Because all our education system, either in the primary school or either in the high school or university, all focusing on in other way, like who will win the race, competition, race, no matter what, values is damn care, we just move ahead. And this will not have a solution. Now, this is the time that we need to have a paradigm shift. Our children, our future generation should understand that this is not the path we should have move ahead. Otherwise, we'll have no future. And as IPCC report of 1.5 degree temperatures, sticking with this temperature, has already indicated, if you move on this one, sooner and later, 2.5 degree, 4 degree, and humanity will be collapsed. And is this the future that we seek? And is it the future that we want to have our children to see? Of course not. So this is the time that we need to go back to the nature and back to the indigenous people. And for that one, we need to have education in the in the school, college, university, about the values of indigenous people, how they have been contributing for climate change resilience. And I'm also faculty, visiting faculty in Kathmandu University. We have already started this initiative. And also, I'm also, because as a facility working group member in activity 3 of FWG as 2 of the work plan, focusing on indigenous curriculum and working in line with the constituent bodies called ACE, Climate Action, Climate Empowerment of within the constituent bodies of the UNCCC. Let's join hands with all the education ministry, come up with the education curriculum, both formal and informal, so that the world knows the value of education, and we already start right now. So this is what. And then another part is part of my work is I have been not only working in the promoting for the indigenous knowledge system, but I believe the basis of protection of our values is land tenure security and recognition of our customary governance system, our values. And that's where the, all the wealth of knowledge lies. We are uprooted from our roots and uprooted from our homelands. And, in the name of the conservation, eviction of our indigenous peoples. Is this the solution we are looking for? We are very, very worried with this post-biodiversity framework concept of coming up with by 2030, increasing 30% of conservation. It's a very, very worrying part for all of us. If it's going to extend another 30% of the conservation, and with the same business as usual model, it will further invite conflicts, chaos, and unsustainability. So this is why we need to join hands at the global forum, all of us, that right-based solution in the conservation is the only way out, and recognition of our customary governance system, our values, our self-governance system, and is the only way out, sustaining our future ahead and the hope for our future generation. Thank you.
Pasang. Ewa chanimre koch ash ruk ma Helen, Nan Helen. We're going to continue with Helen Magata. Helen Biangalén Magata belongs to the Cada Clan indigenous peoples from Paracelis Mountain Province. She is the communications officer at the TEBA, an NGO working for the promotion, protection, and fulfillment of indigenous peoples' rights. In the last 10 years, she has been working in the field of research, education, and communication, especially on the indigenous peoples' rights, climate change, community development, and climate finance. Helen holds a master's degree in development communication from University of the Philippines Open University. She's currently part of the Indigenous Peoples team and is tasked to work on lobbying for the recognition of Indigenous peoples' rights in climate finance, particularly the Green Climate Fund. If you can share with us, Helen, please, what do you see as the positive contributions, or what are the positive contributions of finance that could support Indigenous peoples' sovereignty and also resiliency to climate change?
Thank you, Chair. Amay ayorkiw tako amin. I am speaking my mother tongue to greet everyone here. It's a little not easy to talk after the very beautiful video that was presented by Andrea, and also the powerful intervention by Pasang, but I'll try. So I think I'll start by saying that it's also not very easy to talk about contributions of women without, celebrating Indigenous women's contributions to climate action without first also realizing the challenges that they go through. So we consider the collective recognition of Indigenous people's rights to self-determination and also to our lands, territories, and resources as a primary fundamental element to the recognition in particular of Indigenous women's actions and contributions. So because without recognition of the safeguards of our collective rights as Indigenous peoples, it is unlikely that the specific challenges and also contribution of Indigenous women are recognized as well. So Indigenous women contribute so much in speaking up and also in defending the lands and territories that we have over the world. However, it's also unfortunate to hear that a lot of Indigenous rights and environmental defenders are being persecuted, killed in a daily basis in the defense of these lands and territories that we have. On climate finance, I have 2 points. So the international community has agreed that there's a need for $100 billion per year to be delivered for climate action. And up to now, we don't see that money delivered yet. So I think one, there's a need to deliver that money ASAP as soon as possible. Second, for this COP, we heard that there's a pledge of $1.7 billion for forest and Indigenous peoples, which is of course welcome. But however, the reality we have now is that we do not have any official data to show how much really climate finance Indigenous peoples, especially Indigenous women, are accessing. Where is the climate finance going? How are Indigenous women accessing this money? So ultimately, it's crucial that this climate finance is accessed by, governed by Indigenous peoples themselves. And within that structure and governance that is defined by Indigenous peoples, allocation should be ensured for Indigenous women as well. So in terms of what are the things that we could do better in terms of climate finance, I think there's a need to change narratives and perspectives, because what we see now is that measurement for climate finance is often defined by how much. So the more money, the better, oftentimes. Also, for example, for climate adaptation, it's defined by how many beneficiaries is this money going to benefit. Or in terms of mitigation, it's defined by how many tons of CO2 equivalent. However, I think there's really a need to redefine climate impact in terms of Indigenous women's perspective. We should look, instead of looking at scope, we should look deeper. Like, for example, we saw in the video that women are contributing so much to ensuring that there's enough food, not only for the family, but also for the community. Seed banking, for example, traditional knowledge of Indigenous peoples is often looked down as something obsolete, something that is lower than what the Western science standards have. And they are often community-based and not really national in scope. But these are the things that we are missing when we are measuring impacts of climate finance. So seed banking, seed keeping, community management of scarce water resources, for example, that often women are managing, and they have been tested to work for generations, but are most often, again, as I said, neglected, unsupported, and even criminalized. So in terms of climate finance, we need to shift narratives that big conservation projects are the thing because they deliver more than community-based smaller initiatives like that of Indigenous peoples. But I see that a positive tipping point is when we start to measure climate actions in terms of the depth, cultural indicators, social cultural indicators, which are beyond only economic. We should look at these indicators when we measure impacts of climate finance and impacts of climate actions. So it should be that when what is happening now is that climate actions are measured by all of these COT equivalent, number of beneficiaries. And indicators such as social cultural indicators are only looked at as bonus, but it should be the other way around. We should measure climate impacts in terms of how much really social cultural impacts in terms of livelihoods and well-being of Indigenous peoples and women they are contributing, and only look at mitigation potentials and mitigation results as co-benefits. So it should be, so there's really a need to shift and drastically debunk that myth of measuring climate impacts. Thank you.
So la khawshi katsih shaikh nik qiyari puaqchari qawanak. It's very important words what you have shared with us. Thank you so much for your expertise in this field, as many communities also do not know what is happening at these high levels, and all this information has to trickle down to the communities. Yesterday we were listening to community members that were mentioning that they have not received any funding, and there is a lot of funding when it comes to climate change projects and agreements and private funding and public funding. So very, very important. Thank you so much. And right now I would like to introduce our last speaker, Monica Koch Magnusson. Monica became the first Indigenous woman from Southern Belize to be called to the Belize bar to become a lawyer. For the last decade, she has been engaged in the struggle to defend Maya land rights. She served as local counsel for the Maya Leaders Alliance and the Toledo Alcaldes Association, where she helped advance claims before the Belize highest appellate court, the Caribbean Court of Justice, as well as the Supreme Court of Belize. She was involved in the landmark rights case, Maya Leaders Alliance et al. Versus the Attorney General of Belize. Most recently, she served as co-counsel to the Maya community of Halacte, who was awarded $3 million USD in American dollars in damages for violations of their constitutional rights. It's an honor to present Monica. Monica, please, if you can share with us how all of this information that we are receiving today about strengthening traditional knowledge, ways of living of Indigenous peoples and the role of women, and the management of forests and the transmission of information to awareness on Indigenous knowledge and rights, and the finance of Indigenous initiatives for climate resiliency. How can we tie all this to a human rights or collective rights approach?
Manjosh Avesh, Hinkomanesh, Nintianak Sahej all. I am pleased to be here with you, guests that are here today. In my native language, I just welcomed you, and I pray that you are all doing very well. I'm very humbled to be here among these very strong, knowledgeable women. I have a lot of respect for each one of you and the work that you do. And I'm happy to be here, to be a part of this panel today. One of the things that I've heard uttered over and over again from my elders in my native community of Southern Belize is that without our lands, we are nothing. Those are powerful words. It is important to recognize that Indigenous peoples, our relationship to the land is directly tied to our identity, to our culture, to our very sustenance. And I think for a lot of non-Indigenous people, that might be hard to imagine. Our culture, our languages, just everything about us and our relationship to the land. It's just intrinsic in us that we see the land as our mother. You will hear words from my brothers in South America. They refer to her as Pachamama. In Belize, my own grandmother, we used to refer to her as Natsul, but that's mother. That comes from the idea that the land is our mother. So we have a sacred obligation to her, to love her, to protect her, and not to abuse her. Indigenous women are on the forefront of this climate change crisis. And it's important to recognize, as you've heard some of the panelists here mention, that despite that, their adaptation methods have proven to be a solution to this climate change crisis that we face today. But we need to acknowledge that. We need to see that. It's no secret that the way that Indigenous people stewards their lands, it provides a direct climate change solution for all of us, and it will benefit all of us, but we have to see it, we have to acknowledge it. And one of the ways that we can do that is to recognize and respect their governance structures, like Helen pointed out, to recognize land tenure security, which is absolutely, absolutely important. That it is known that once Indigenous peoples are displaced from their lands, they lose their identity, their cultures. So land tenure security and taking a rights-based approach when it comes to that is absolutely important. And what can governments do? What can we do? What can you do? Well, we can. Local governments can really start. If governments are and I say local governments as well as the global community, if we are really, really serious about combating climate change, we're here today talking about we need to stop talking and start doing. And one of the ways that we can do that is by taking a rights-based approach. That is really putting to work the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, putting protocols in place that follow the free, prior, and informed consent of Indigenous peoples. You heard Pasang say that one of the solutions that has been discussed at COP26 is an increase by 30% of conservation. And that sounds all good, but I fear that that 30% is going to directly impact the lands that are used and occupied by Indigenous communities. conservation efforts have, from my experience, have taken an approach does not take into consideration the rights of Indigenous peoples to their lands and territories. In fact, they remove people from their lands instead of recognizing that the stewardship by Indigenous women on these lands is really a solution to climate change. But they don't see that. There's that disconnect. And so, like Helen was saying, we need to change the narrative. We need to see it differently for what it is. We need to acknowledge that Indigenous women, because of their millennial-old knowledge of taking care of Mother Earth, of taking care of providing for their families by taking care of the sacred places, the land, the water, and tying all of that together, that in the way that we live, we maintain the biodiversity that we find ourselves in. And so I think that it's no secret that lands that are managed by Indigenous peoples are actually the most forested. At least in Southern Middle East, that is the case. You can tell the difference. And so leading climate researchers have seen this. They've seen that there's an urgent need, and I'm just reading a quote from an article that I read the other day that says, to make collective tenure security a critical part of emission reduction strategies, that empowering forest peoples to continue their historical role as stewards of the environment is essential for stabilizing Earth's climate. So when Indigenous peoples have rights to their lands, they're able to steward these lands in ways that prevent fossil fuel extraction, maintain carbon capturing forests, soil regeneration, and carbon capture through traditional agriculture and agroecology, and protect biodiversity. So the gap between recognized and unrecognized land rights points to significant opportunities to scale up protection of Indigenous lands. And so again, I encourage that the global community as well as local communities, to do everything to support the work that Indigenous women are doing in their communities. And one of the ways they can do that is they can fund them, get financing to them. But we have to get financing. We have to do it in such a way that local Indigenous communities are directly benefiting. These programs, like you said, change the narrative. The programs that normally come, there's a lot of funding out there, but it does not reach Indigenous communities, but particularly women. It does not support their projects, but we need to shift the way we do things. I saw a cartoon yesterday at COP26, and there's this picture of this house burning. And there are two guys discussing whether they should give the individual owner of that house a bucket of water. And the question was, but will she or he use it wisely? And I think that's where we are right now. We have to stop thinking in those terms, and again, change the narrative and recognize the significant impact that Indigenous women, Indigenous peoples have on climate change solutions. I thank you very much.
Matthew Shawe, Mónica. Muchas gracias, Mónica. So we are going to continue with our last round of questions, a very short time for each of you. Based on your experience at COP26 and areas of work, what do you think are the key opportunities to support, resource, and engage Indigenous women and Indigenous peoples in general in climate change following the conclusion of COP26? We're going to start with Andrea.
Thank you so much. Indigenous peoples, through the work of what's called the Indigenous Caucus. The long name is the International Indigenous Peoples Forum on Climate Change, have been directly engaged in all of the negotiations to ensure that the rights of Indigenous peoples are protected. For example, in Article 6 of the Paris Rulebook, that is talking about forest offsets, market-based solutions, and also what they call non-market-based solutions, which includes, and I share the concern of our sisters for the imposition of so-called conservation areas on Indigenous peoples' lands. And I have many examples. I don't have time to share in the Americas, North America, Latin America, of Indigenous peoples whose water supplies, whose right to gather firewood, to hunt fish and gather on these areas where they've always maintained and used them, and now are actually put in jail, for doing the things that they always did, because now they're protected or now they're conserved. I think just the other point that is a focus for us in the facilitative working group of the LSIP, Local Communities Indigenous Peoples Platform, we had a historic event yesterday, actually bringing 28 knowledge holders from each of the 7 regions. We had 4, including youth, including women, including elders, food producers, to talk to each other and other Indigenous peoples about what solutions they're developing, what threats they're facing, and what their proposals are. And so we look forward to tomorrow sharing at least some of the key messages. We haven't produced the final report or anything yet. It's only been a day. But we look forward to sharing some key messages that they brought into this process, many of them coming for the first time, many of them coming out of their communities for the first time ever to participate here. So in a nutshell, I will say that the voices of Indigenous peoples must be heard. Our knowledge keepers, our wisdom holders, our practitioners, our food producers on the ground. And we are dedicated to continue to at least facilitate that. Whether we'll be listened to, that's another matter, but they need to listen to us because their survival is at stake too. We have to make it clear that those state negotiators, their grandchildren's lives are on the line the same way that ours are in this struggle. And we look forward to enhancing and increasing the participation of Indigenous peoples here, especially our grassroots communities. Thank you.
Yeah, I think our main challenge in terms of climate finance is that we do not have a particular agenda within the narrative of climate finance for Indigenous peoples. We still, there's a long way to go because the states are just talking about developing countries, but there's no one size fits all approach. Within developing countries or even within developed countries, there are different intersectionalities, and an agenda on Indigenous peoples, particularly on Indigenous women within the climate finance discussion should be in place, because direct access finance that is adequate and equitable for Indigenous peoples will continue to, Indigenous peoples are going to do what they're doing, whether or not we have climate finance. But of course, climate finance resources can help Indigenous peoples, including Indigenous women, to better maintain and also restore and enhance their knowledge, and also for them to be able to have equal voice at the decision-making processes. So I have a list here of what other climate finance can help Indigenous peoples do, but I'm happy to discuss this maybe bilaterally after the session. Thanks.
So think now, yeah, thank you. Yeah, I see in the discussion here in COP26 is one of the main challenges is our direct engagements in the policy discourse. We wish to bring some changes in climate policies, but we are screaming from outside, with our observer badges, what you call, no? But the main core discussion, negotiation is within the bodies, of the state parties. So still journey is far away, still for us to have direct engagement in the discourse of climate change and bringing some change that we wish to have. However, the efforts of the caucus is continuously there. The establishment of the platform is also another hope for bringing the voice of indigenous people. I just would like to share my own journey in summary, that the climate change started in 1992, that we were not there, right? But heard like 7 indigenous people or few numbers of people were there screaming themselves our rights issue. I joined climate change discourse from 2009, following the COP from 2009. In 2009, I just reflect my own experience. Just to even include the indigenous peoples, we had to follow the parties with the paper. Excuse me, sir, can you please, support this language? So this is the experience I had in 2008 and 2009. But at least now, the situation is a little bit changed, it's a bit improved, no? Our voice started being heard, at least not within the core negotiation team, but there is a space for, like, a platform is one of the space, caucus is there. So this is the progress I have seen. So, if there is, let's have a hope, there is no way out, sooner or later we'll be there. So that is my belief, and we should have that faith within all of us. That's how we can move ahead. And I believe that our voice has been already heard. And then this is the first time, surprisingly, I have heard in COP26 is we have been always screaming for direct fund for indigenous people, and we have been satisfied with the drops of the dedicated fund like a DGM or other small grant funds or like that, no. But this is the first time I think also in the history that 1.7 billion for dedicated for indigenous people. But how it's been, we have a procedures, methodology for the direct access is it the right one? 1.7, right? Yeah, I'm not good in mathematics. Yeah, so, but how is the methodology, how is access, process, mechanism is very need to be built on further. But if we have the solidarity to join hands, I mean, there is a way out, and we should believe on ourselves. Yeah, thank you.
Well, it's hard to follow all of that, but you ladies are correct, and you're right that inclusion of our indigenous voices is absolutely important. We need to have a seat at the table. We need to have a say in policies that are being created that will have a direct impact on us as indigenous women. We're not there yet, but that needs to change, and the governments can start there, including us, listening to us, taking our voices and our considerations into listening to what we have to say, because we have a lot to say. Also, direct access to funding. How do we do that? We cannot keep going, like Helen said, as business. We cannot continue with this business as usual approach. We need to change the narrative. We need to change how we do business. And recognizing that by helping indigenous people and supporting their ways of stewardship, by ensuring that there's land tenure security, that all of this benefits all of us. It benefits my child, and it will also benefit your child. It benefits the global community, and we have to remember that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Monica, Pasang, Helen, Andrea. It's a great honor for me to be sitting at this table with you, with your great expertise and your experience from your own territories, and on behalf of our communities and on behalf of women. It's very important also to thank all those efforts as well, other community efforts that are happening at the same time as Indigenous people struggle. The efforts of youth, for example, the efforts of women in other communities, and an invitation also to civil society, to academia, to other nonprofit organizations, to other youth, to create alliances with Indigenous communities, because it's important. We all need to change how things are going in terms of climate change. And with this, I would like to thank all the participants and all of those that are listening to us via Zoom or via the internet. Just to give my final remarks, thank you so much. Cultural Survival is an organization that put together this panel. Cultural Survival is a nonprofit organization that was established in 1972 and is Indigenous-led. We work in different regions of the world to sustain or to support initiatives for self-government or self-determination of Indigenous peoples. And with that, thank you so much. Maldios Chiwe Iwonohel.